Okay, it falls to me, in the absence of our director, Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste, who can't be here today, but who sends her regards to all of you, and especially to our speaker, to introduce today's lecture. My name is Adam Holmes. I'm the Assistant Director of the Du Bois Center, and it's wonderful to see loads of familiar faces, but also some new faces in the crowd for what is a really wonderful opportunity, because usually here at the center we have our own cadre of radical revolutionary scholars who we fund through our fellowship program, who come here throughout the year to give talks. But it's a special privilege when we can welcome a scholar from our great friends and partners at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at New Africa House. And an even greater privilege when that scholar is only with us for a short amount of time. And Heitor Guimarães is here this semester from Brazil, the University of Campinas, is that right? Yeah, where he is a master's student in the philosophy department. I just read that on my phone. And he is visiting with us, and we met earlier this semester, and I said, why don't you, at the conclusion of your stay, come to the center, tell us about your work, what you've learned while being here in the Du Bois papers and other related collections, so that we can benefit from your insights. So it's with enormous pleasure that I welcome Heitor to the podium, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. Thank you, sir.
Let me not forget about the time. Okay, so thank you, Adam, for this wonderful introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking the Du Bois Center for giving me this extraordinary opportunity. This is actually the first time I am invited to give a lecture of this kind, and I am delighted that it's taking place exactly in this space that is dedicated to Du Bois's intellectual legacy. I would also like to say thank you to all of my friends, my colleagues from the FROM, the faculty and staff who saved some time to be here today, and to my friends in Brazil who might be watching at this very moment. Now, I am aware that the standard practice in this space is to give talks on issues internal to Du Bois's thought. But today, I'm going to do something slightly different. So, as the title suggests, my proposal is to use a Du Boisian lens to analyze a case of modern Brazilian history that I consider to be of the utmost importance for all of us who are concerned about racial justice and reparations. And you may have noticed from the time scope that it is not exactly a new case, but it has only recently regained public attention. And at the center of this analysis is the concept that, for reasons I'm going to explain, I am calling dark labor. So this concept I intend to be an interpretation of what it means to think of labor from the point of view of Du Bois' sociology. In other words, in what ways does the color line affect, shape the organization of labor in capitalist society? So that is the idea. And the way I'm going to unfold this talk is that first I'm going to give some theoretical explanation. I'm going to go over some basic lines of Du Bois' thought to explain how this concept derives from the work he has done. And for me, the Du Bois that matters most here is the late Du Bois, the Marxist Du Bois, the Du Bois from Black Reconstruction onwards. I'm going to use the first few minutes for that. Then I'm going to give an account of the case I chose to speak about, and I'm going to show how this concept may be useful to explain real situations, to make sense out of real situations with this particular case. So, that said, I'd like to begin with Du Bois's 1935 masterpiece, Black Reconstruction America. I assume most of you are already familiar with this work. For those who are not, this is the book in which Du Bois covers the period between 1860 and 1880, comprehending the American Civil War and the following 15 years with the ascension and fall of what we now know as the Reconstruction. There we find some of Du Bois's most influential theses: that the Civil War was first and foremost a war over slavery, that Southern Black slaves emancipated themselves rather than having been emancipated by a stroke of Abraham Lincoln's pen, that Reconstruction represented a unique opportunity for Black political empowerment and whose demise returned the free men and freed women to a situation similar to bondage. Now, because of those groundbreaking theses, Black Reconstruction became well known as a revisionist piece of scholarship of American history, as well as a landmark of Du Bois's turn to historical materialism, which it is indeed. For my purpose here, however, what matters most is the theoretical framework that underlies the book's analysis. In my view, the singularity of Black Reconstruction resides in its particular understanding of human labor. From the outset, the book was one of the first to insist that Black people enslaved in the American South and other places should be regarded as a particular kind of workers, whose position was defined by a global color line. These Black workers, as Du Bois called them, were charged with the very basis of the industrial economy, supplying primary goods for the proletariats of New England and Europe to turn into commodities. So by calling them Black workers instead of slaves, Du Bois implied that they should be seen as members of an unfree working class, distinguished from their white counterparts by race and status. By the same token, Du Bois considered that the political struggles in which the Black folk engaged for freedom and later for civil rights should also be regarded as a labor movement, acting on the same political landscape as trade unionism and socialism. In Black Reconstruction, the struggles of Black workers over citizenship, land, and education are not represented as unrelated to those of white workers over wage and better working conditions. Neither are they conflated into some colorblind, class-centered perspective. Rather, as Du Bois puts it, these two labor movements, that's his expression, were actually two sides of the same coin, as their plights were rooted in the same oppressive system. On defining them as labor movements, he emphasized that despite their different claims and different strategies, they were fighting two faces of a single enemy, and that in both cases, labor was a central issue. As those movements failed to grasp their commonality, they fell prey to racial divisions and missed the opportunity to unite and, quote, in their union become irresistible. That's Black Reconstruction. Only together, Du Bois claimed, could they have achieved enough strength to subvert the capitalist order and succeed in their respective goals. Now, what I want us to retain from this summarization is this idea of two kinds of labor, two kinds of labor movements. In Du Bois's narrative, we find out that labor under capitalism takes not only one, but actually two basic forms. On the one hand, that is what Karl Marx and others have called the free labor that we know all too well, the relation in which propertyless individuals sell out their workforce in exchange for a salary that doesn't match the true value of their services. On the other hand, we have a second regime of unfree labor coercively extracted from colored people by someone else who controls their very bodies and lives. It is this second regime, which Du Bois displays as free labor's racialized other, that I shall call dark labor. In this sense, dark labor designates a whole domain of racially oriented labor relations that remain as one of capitalism's most enduring features, even after the demise of chattel slavery. In Du Bois's late writings on colonialism of the 1940s through 1960s, this framework reappears with a broader international scope. In the 19th century, once permanent bondage was no longer an option in the Americas, the capitalist powers of Western Europe decided to foster subhuman forms of work within Africa and Asia itself. By replacing transatlantic slave trade with remote colonial rule, capitalists managed to keep a two-level structure where free workers in the core, that is, in Europe, would manufacture all sorts of goods out of wood, coal, iron, rubber, copper, and other raw materials carved out by what Du Bois called, quote, the darker races of the world, referring to non-white peoples of Africa, Asia, and America, whose labor was neither free nor paid. For the author of Black Reconstruction, then, that dark labor and the riches it extracted from African soil was so central to capitalism that it was the ultimate cause behind the two world wars. That is what he explains in his famous 1915 article, The African Roots of War. In an article of 1961 about Nigeria to the National Guardian, Du Bois wrote, quote, "If Western capital can put into war industry and commerce this black labor working on raw materials, it can by modern methods leave in the hand of capitalists an incalculable power to control mankind." That's the end of quotation. So in the political economy of race and capital, we might conclude, free labor turns out to be merely a foreground, resting on an even deeper layer that Du Bois referred to, quote, "a dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in West Indies and Central America, in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry." Now, I want to emphasize about the quote that Du Bois writes, "rest today," even though he's referring to the 1800s, but meaning that he's talking about something that is real in the time he's writing, that is 1935. So with this formulation, Du Bois offers a powerful update to Karl Marx's account of capitalism, who famously described the modern proletariat as a doubly free work, in the sense that he is, and I'm quoting Marx, "the free proprietor of his own labor capacity, hence of his person, whereas he has no other commodity for sale." For Marx, on the one hand, the prerequisite for labor exploitation is that both the capitalist and the worker must appear as, quote, "equals in the eyes of the law, even though deeply separated by wealth and class." By contrast, Du Bois looks at the other side of the color line, showing that capitalism never really ceased to rely on unfreedom in the periphery. Where Marx denounced free labor as a disguise for class domination, Du Bois denounced unfreedom and dark labor as a ground for race empire and black expropriation. Thus, in the light of this distinction between free and dark labor, Du Bois's merit was to unveil the secret transatlantic thread running from the African-American slave to the European proletariat, from the hardships of the plantation toil to those of the factory work, from the interests of the slaver landowner to those of the industrial businessman. So centering the darker side of the color line, we come to understand that bondage and unfreedom is not a setback to modern regimes of accumulation, but one of its enabling conditions. That behind the world of free labor, which is the realm of employers and employees, of labor unions and strikes, lies an unacknowledged underworld of dark labor, which is the realm of masters and bondsmen, of dispossession and dehumanization. In the 21st century, we might say, dark labor encompasses a range of ongoing forms of racialized unfree work that still sustain capitalism to this day. Otherwise, how can we make sense of the millions of working prison inmates, most of whom are black, whose cheap or unpaid labor sustain prison facilities while producing billions of dollars per year in goods and services for public use? The same could be asked about the countless undocumented migrants, both in Europe and in the United States, trafficked and forced to serve as cleaners, cooks, sewers, builders, and sellers at the edge of mere virtual survival. Finally, what about the thousands of laboring black children in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Burkina Faso, and other places whose daily mining work provides Apple, Samsung, Ford, Dell, and many other big companies with the essential minerals for making our cell phones, computers, TVs, car batteries, and more recently, AIs. So no matter where or at what segment we look, there is still, to use the Bois expression again, a dark and vast sea of human labor behind it. Now, a lot has been said about free labor, especially in the Marxist tradition. Accepting the two-sided character of capitalist labor requires us to consider what are dark labor's defining features. So in my account of this concept, that dark labor is defined by three grounding features. The first is what I already mentioned, that dark labor is an unfree regime of work. And here, unfreedom means that it is performed either under explicit coercion or under conditions of extreme vulnerability that leave someone with no real choice but to comply with performing a certain task. In contrast with free labor relations, the subjects of dark labor are never seen as legally autonomous individuals, but as bodies whose energy and physical strength is socially constructed as available for plunder. From an economic perspective, the main point of unfreedom is to render the worker unable to strive over the value of their workforce and thereby undermine their capacity to resist expropriation. The second feature is what I call social opacity. Essentially, this means that dark labor operates under a regime of social invisibility. This idea first appears in Du Bois's 1925 essay, Words of Color, where he urges us not to restrict the concept of labor to, quote, that labor which we see and feel and exercise right around us. That's the end of quotation. Calling our attention to the fact that we often largely ignore how the commodities surrounding us are produced by labor extracted with violence, theft, and blood. In this sense, the darkness of dark labor has to do with the fact that it resists to be acknowledged as one of the driving forces behind capitalist accumulation. It remains aside from all officially sanctioned working practice, lurking in what Du Bois called the world shadow. Thanks to its social opacity, we are never aware to what extent we are supplied with dark labor byproducts, be they the clothes we wear, the food we eat, or the electronics we use. The third and last feature of dark labor is that it is racially marked. This feature stems from the other Du Boisian meaning of darkness, the assignment of social positions according to hierarchies defined by the color line. So for Du Bois, in fact, the only real commonality between all non-white peoples is holding the burden of the most subhuman and exploitative forms of work in capitalist society. We must remember, though, that while his focus has always been the people of African descent in America, he never overlooked the situation of other racialized folks, like the so-called coolies in East Asia, to give one example, whose oppression was also justified in racial grounds. In this sense, dark labor is not only normally assigned to non-white groups, it cannot exist unless racial boundaries between human beings remain in place. So with this theoretical groundings in mind, I would like to show now how the concept of dark labor helps us make sense of a real case of modern Brazilian history. The case I have chosen is a forced labor scandal that happened in Pará, a state of northern Brazil whose territory overlaps with the Amazon rainforest. So just to give us some geographical location, I believe most of you are familiar with South America, right? You see that this green area is the whole of the Amazon rainforest. The lighter green area is what is contained in Brazil. It corresponds to almost 60% of the Amazon. So you see that it's way up north in Brazil. Just to give you an idea, the economic center, which is São Paulo and Rio, São Paulo is here is Rio, 2,000 miles away from there, okay? And looking a little closer now, I want to call your attention to this state right here. This one is Pará, highlighted in red. It is the state where I was born. It has 2 times the size of France, okay? Pretty huge. And the story I'm going to tell now happened in one of the counties right in the southern area of Pará called Santana do Araguaias. Araguaias is a river that passes right nearby. The place is called Santana do Araguaia, okay? So that's given some location. This case first came to public notice in 1983 thanks to the initiative of the Pastoral Commission of Land. It's an organization whose name in Portuguese is Comissão Pastoral da Terra. The resume is CPT, okay? Which is a grassroots Catholic organization of priests and laymen inspired by liberation theology that has been calling for social justice and land redistribution in Brazil for more than 50 years now. In a time where labor unions and left-wing parties faced severe limits to act in the countryside of Brazil, the CPT was one of the few institutions to which rural workers and peasants could resort to report abuses committed by their employers and landowners. To this day, the CPT holds a remarkable collection of documents on human rights violations committed against hinterland populations since its foundation in 1975. Among them, there is one that stands out for its cruelty. So the stage of the story I'm going to tell is a cattle ranch owned by no other than the German automobile company Volkswagen. Now, in December 2024, based on the CPT archive, the Public Ministry of Brazil opened a lawsuit against Volkswagen, accusing her of maintaining hundreds of workers in slavery-like condition in Pará, the place I just mentioned, for more than 12 years, 4 decades ago, in the 1970s and 1980s, more specifically from 1974 to 1986. On August 29, 2025, Volkswagen was found guilty of our accusations and convicted to pay a $30,000 fine, I'm calculating for Brazilian money, okay, and to formally apologize for the wrongs. Now, it is important to mention here that I hold a law degree in Brazil. This grants me access to the whole of this lawsuit, so I could check all the documents. That was my main source to tell the story, okay? Now, that statement may strike you as puzzling. After all, why would an automobile company be interested in running an agribusiness enterprise in the first place? And why in the middle of a rainforest of all places? So the reason for this requires a little historical clarification. Okay? When this case occurred, Volkswagen had been enjoying a profitable situation in the country for a while. Ever since the end of World War II, the company had redirected its efforts toward Latin America, and Brazil became its biggest market outside Germany already in the late 1950s, with a large industrial park established in São Paulo. So the headquarters of Volkswagen were in São Paulo. Okay? The situation changed in 1964, when Brazil was assaulted by a military dictatorship funded by the United States that would last up until 1985. During this time, Volkswagen experienced a boost as it never had before. By the end of the 1970s, it had opened more than 800 new resale units, produced over 3 million vehicles, and achieved a profit of $103 billion, the highest of all private corporations, dominating the Brazilian automobile market by more than 50%. The Beetle became the most popular vehicle among the middle class and a token of individual success. In a little more than a decade, Volkswagen increased its workforce from 50,000 employees in 1966 to 150,000 in 1975, while producing an amount of riches equivalent to 1% of Brazil's GDP in the same period. Now, part of the explanation for this economic prominence has to do with the military repressive policy towards free labor. From the outset, the regime froze salaries and crushed labor unions, fostering conditions where Volkswagen could extract surplus value from its employees facing little working-class resistance. In 2020, an investigation would show that the corporation's managers cooperated with the regime, providing information for a plot that led to the imprisonment and torture of some labor union leaders in São Paulo. However important as that background may be, if we look at it from the framework I provided before, we realize that this is still only the free labor side of the story. When Du Bois analyzed the role of private European companies in colonial contexts, like rubber tapping in Liberia, cocoa cropping in Nigeria, or diamond mining in South Africa, he always insisted that one must pay attention to what hidden purposes these companies served behind their declared activities. So in order to fully grasp the reason behind Volkswagen's economic prominence, we must follow Du Bois's twofold conception of labor and look for the dark economy lurking behind in the peripheral zone. In the case of Brazil, the periphery corresponds to the Northeast and above all to the Amazon. As many other authoritarian regimes aligned with the capitalist West in the Cold War, Brazil adopted a project of economic development through the opening of its internal market to foreign private companies by creating an attractive environment for international investors. When it comes to the Amazon, which comprises over 60% of the Brazilian territory, this policy took the form of a whole colonization project whose goal was to turn the region into a new commodity frontier. To that end, in 1966, the government created the Superintendence for the Development of the Amazon, the SUDAM. Among other things, this entity was responsible for assigning reduced taxes, fostering the building of new highways connecting parts of the country that were previously isolated, and most of all, granting huge pieces of land for private entrepreneurs to begin large-scale agricultural farming or cattle livestock production. It was expected that the more foreign firms settle in the area, the faster the Amazon will rise toward economic development, quote unquote. As a minister of the Interior once declared, quote, the future of the Amazon lies in the hands of businessmen, whether Brazilian or foreign, for Brazil has lost its fears of foreign capital. That's the end of quotation. That was on the public speech of one of the ministers in the military dictatorship. Over the years, the Sudan funded several companies to carry out initiatives of the kind. The biggest one ever to venture in such a bold enterprise was Volkswagen. Seduced by these new profitable opportunities, the German corporation submitted a proposal to establish a cattle ranch in the Amazon and successfully applied for a large federal grant. Upon the project's approval in 1973, Volkswagen purchased a piece of land in the county of Santana da Araguaia in southeastern Pará. The property was strategically located close to the brand new highway leading to the capital of Brazil and had an impressive area of 536 square miles. And this means that this estate was larger than the current size of New York City. Okay? According to the original project, half of that area was supposed to be deforested to give way to livestock farming, while the other half should be preserved for, quote-unquote, environmental care. So this was a picture. I can explain the context of the pictures in the end in the Q&A, but this is a picture of the ranch. This side here reads pasture number 215. So they had at least 215 pastures. This is just to give you an idea of how huge this is. Okay. In order to ensure the investment's profitability, the German managers decided to equip the ranch with the sharpest technology available. They first selected an expensive Indian cattle breed called Nelore, praised for its resistance to warm temperatures and tropical disease, known at the time as the ox of the future, quote unquote. Furthermore, they had a last generation computer installed at Volkswagen's headquarters in São Paulo to monitor the humidity of the soil and the quality of the grass. In addition, the ranch signed a contract with a highly skilled team of agronomist scientists from the Federal Polytechnic College in Zurich, Switzerland, and the University of Georgia in the United States, in order to supervise the cattle's health and growing. The few permanent staff, roughly 300 people, had access to a set of exclusive facilities, including a bakery, a guest house, a swimming pool, and football fields. The ranch was then inaugurated in 1974 and was named Cristalino River Valley, after a river nearby in the region, or simply Cristalino. So this is the name of the place, Cristalino, okay? People of the nearby villages came to call it Volkswagen's farm. According to the president of Volkswagen Brazilian segment, Wolfgang Sauer, the ranch was meant to be home to the finest slaughterhouse of the Americans and feed the poor population all over Latin America. In all respects, Cristalino seemed to be the ultimate fulfillment of quote-unquote modernization envisioned by the Brazilian authoritarian regime. However, there was another problem to be solved, and this is where dark labor comes to the fore. Virtually all of Volkswagen's land was covered by thick tropical forests that had to be removed in advance to create room for the cattle. With almost no roads connecting the property to the highway, it would be too costly to bring trucks or other heavy machinery. Given the low demographic density of the Amazon and Cristalino's huge dimension, there were not enough free workers available for employment either. How then will Volkswagen recruit the required workforce for the task? The solution was a sophisticated form of modern slavery. The process unfolded as follows. And here, another clarification. The only information we know about what happened inside the ranch was given by survivor workers who provided an oral testimony that was written down by the members of the CPT. So there's a lot of them. I won't have the time to read them aloud. The description I'm going to give now summarizes the content of those reports, okay? At the superficial level, Volkswagen would make outsourcing contracts with single-member firms owned by individuals known at the place as cats. Essentially, the cats were entrepreneurs famous for their ability to deceive people. So that is the reason they were called cats. Their role consisted of traveling to counties far away from the Cristalino ranch, most of the time in other Brazilian states. So coming back to this map, they would travel all the way from this state, Mato Grosso, this state called Tocantins, this state called Maranhão. They would travel very far away from Cristalino, looking for healthy men who seemed strong enough for hard manual labor, whether it be digging the soil, building fences, or in our case, clearing woods. In these small towns where job opportunities were scarce, and the education system was underserved, the cats would advertise excellent salaries for people willing to work in Cristalino for a few months. The offer normally included free transportation, housing, healthcare, clothing, food for the first month. Sometimes a certain amount of money was paid in advance to the worker's family. Once they had managed to gather a significant group of individuals, the cats would put them in a vehicle and head back to Cristalino. Upon their arrival, though, the workers would soon find out that the conditions were not at all as promised. As soon as the vehicle crossed the borders, entering Pará again, each one of them would be literally sold. I said sold, no metaphor here, okay? Sold to another cat for an amount that nowadays corresponds more or less to $25. And then they will be escorted into the estate again. Once inside Cristalino, they would be introduced to a system of spoliation based on debt. That is the central idea, debt. Firstly, they would be fully charged for the supplies, clothes, and payments in advance they received so far, creating a debt, quote unquote, to be paid at the end of the following month. Second, from the moment they were put to work, whatever goods or commodities they ever needed, including food, hygiene products, hats, boots, socks, and working tools, would have to be bought from a canteen, a small store, run by the cats themselves within the farm, where prices were absurdly more expensive than normal. As the nearest towns with markets lie hundreds of miles away and there were no transportation services, the workers had no option but to buy everything from the canteen. Every item they purchased would be added to the initial debt, which will grow larger and larger by the day. The work itself was hard and exhaustive, beginning at dawn to long after dark, with no breaks or weekends or holidays. The only way to have lunch was to wake up a few hours earlier and prepare it themselves before marching to the woods. In the frontier, they labored out in the open with no protection from heat, rain, and mosquitoes. The spaces where the workers lived and slept were equally precarious. There were no restrooms, no drinking water than a local stream, and no cooking facilities. To be fair, there were no real housing facilities either. The only shelter available were the tents the workers managed to build on their own out of wood and plastic bought from the canteen. In the absence of windows and doors, they were unprotected against the weather, against snakes, spiders, scorpions, and other animals in the night. When it comes to salaries, in the end of every month, The cats would claim that workers had not cleared enough pasture to cover for their supposed debt, refusing to pay them and forcing them to stay in the ranch for another few months. And so the cycle of debt bondage would start over and over again. On top of that, should anyone ever try to run, both the entrance of the ranch and the clearing frontier were heavily guarded by gunmen at the service of the cats, who oversaw workers' daily activities and make sure they completed the designated tasks as soon as possible. No one could get in or out of the farm without express authorization of the cats. At the end of a season, when the clearing of a certain area was finished, some of them would be dismissed, meaning abandoned outside Cristalino's gates with no food or resources. As several incident reports collected by the CPT show, many of them never made it back home. So then comes another picture. Oh, this is an advertisement on the Cristalino ranch. It reads, Volkswagen produced in the Amazon. You see the cattle breed. Okay. Let's move forward. This picture was taken during an expedition inside the ranch in 1983. I'm going to speak about it towards the end. But this shows how the system I just described worked. So when this picture was taken, there was this guy. He had just ran away from the ranch. He had been captured back by those men around him, who are the cats. They were taking him back to the farm. So this illustrates how it works. It is not possible to say exactly how many men were kept in that situation during the 12 years the ranch was active. Data from the CPT suggests that in the first semester of 1984, only one of the cats, the most famous one, controlled approximately 403 workers alone, which implies that the number of victims reached a few thousands to the very least. Further descriptions provided by survivors include mistreatment, physical aggression, and the denial of health care to the fellow workers who fell ill with malaria, a very common disease in the tropical areas. Not to mention the murder of non-complying workers whose bodies had never been found. Under such appalling circumstances, those men were trapped in a system of debt bondage. And just like Du Bois described the certain black folks after Reconstruction, they were, that's Du Bois' phrase, slaves in all but name. Now, if we put the description of this modern slavery scheme face to face with the highly sophisticated infrastructure I mentioned before, we face a puzzling question. So how is it possible that a top multinational corporation that has the most advanced resources available resort to a supposedly outdated bondage system that goes back to times of chattel slavery? Or, to put it another way, how can cutting-edge technology coexist with seemingly archaic practices of unfree work? The answer is to be found in the Du Boisian framework of the hidden nexus between free and dark labor in capitalist wealth production I explained before. To begin with, the debt bondage system matched all of the key aspects of dark labor I outlined before. Number one, they were unfree, unpaid, underfed, triply imprisoned by geographical isolation, physical restraints, and the moral feeling of indebtedness. Two, they were socially invisible, never being mentioned in any staff documentation left by Cristalino, and completely cut off from any communication with the outside world. So the linkage between their suffering and the beef exported by Volkswagen will never come to the fore. Three, being migrants for other lands and other states and cultures, as was often the case, they were racially marked as outsiders, lacking nearby friend or family networks, and thus easier prey to deceive. In this sense, as a variety of dark labor, this debt bondage system was not at all outdated. It was quite efficient for Volkswagen, since without it, there would be no clear land for the cattle to live in the first place. But that's not all. As a matter of fact, the debt bondage system was in no way exclusive to Volkswagen. By the end of the 1970s, when Cristalino was at its peak, the enslavement of rural workers through debt had become the standard practice in a number of other huge estates all over the Brazilian Amazon. According to the sociologist José de Souza Martins, between 1970 and 1993, the same kind of enslavement was deployed in at least 308 rural properties in the region, inflicting this same system over 85,000 workers to the very least. In 22% of the cases, he goes on, there is evidence that at least one worker has been murdered. Remarkably, just like Cristalino, most of those ranches belong to firms whose official trade apparently had nothing to do with agriculture or livestock farming. Many of them were banks, credit institutions, civil construction companies, electricity companies with their headquarters placed in São Paulo or Rio. So if we look from a broader perspective, what we see in late 20th century Brazil is a structural division that resembles the one theorized by Du Bois in his Marxist term. On the one hand, a set of private corporations rooted in the southeastern economic center, whose only source appeared to be free labor, free employment. On the other hand, deep inside the Amazon hinterlands, there was a vast and dark sea of human labor, to use the Du Boisian image again, creating the very conditions that allowed those primary public business to thrive. From this point of view, although the unfree workers of ranches like Cristalino did not manufacture commodities themselves as their industrial counterparts did in São Paulo, they laid the ground so the actual surplus value extraction could take place elsewhere. In other words, the success of Volkswagen and her likes should be seen as a result of the coordination of the two kinds of labor in different phases of the same accumulation process, since it was the expropriation of dark labor in the periphery that secretly provided the foundations for the exploitation of free labor in the core. Take the case of Cristalino again. True, the automobile industry in São Paulo was and has always been Volkswagen's chief trade, and its basis was the exploitation of free employees. But under the laws of the military regime, those factories were only eligible to a number of tax exemption and funding programs as long as they remained investing their profits in other projects in the Amazon frontier. The advantages of this were just too considerable to turn away. So keeping Cristalino in operation was essential was essential for Volkswagen to maintain its leading position in the Brazilian market. But like all other companies who decided to take their chance with the rainforests, it was one thing to settle a ranch and quite another to keep it in motion. Only dark labor, with its defining features, provided the necessary assets to make that possible. Firstly, the benefits of unfreedom were both economic and strategic. Given the scarceness of free work for hard tasks in the region, unless labor wasn't free, it would have been impossible to keep the clearing of the forest at a constant pace for the livestock to evolve. By the same token, having an army of unpaid peons who could not choose to leave their job provided an extraordinary cost reduction that mitigated eventual economic losses in case the breeding of the selected species did not unfold as expected. Besides, as the recruitment and surveillance of the workers was outsourced to the cats, they could always be pointed out as the ones to blame should anyone try to hold Volkswagen accountable for her crimes. Second, the same goes for the social opacity of dark labor. To be sure, the plight of the workers in Cristalino or other debt bondage farms was no secret to nearby citizens. Nevertheless, the cats and their gunmen commanded an extensive network of traders, innkeepers, grocery store owners, brothel owners, and others, and even local policemen who earned a great deal of money from that bondage system, either by advertising the deceitful job offers to people who circulated in their establishments, or by providing the cats with information on the whereabouts of eventual runaways. More often than not, even local policemen were part of those networks, returning fugitive workers to their captors instead of protecting them. The actors of this small economy were committed to ensure that the outside world would never find out what was going on. Nevertheless, this plot would not hold for long. I said that it was the entanglement of free and dark labor that built Volkswagen's empire. Let me finish by saying how a new arrangement of those two brought it to an end. In the early 1980s, the silence of Cristalino's dirty secret was finally broken, thanks to the initiative of a priest. Father Ricardo Rezende was a local parish in southeastern Pará and a coordinator of the CPT organization. He belonged to that generation of clergymen inspired by liberation theology that sought to promote social emancipation by fostering the rise of labor movements among countryside workers in the Amazon, many of whom had suffered the same fate as the workers of Cristalino. Years in service of the poor made Father Rezende an enemy in the eyes of big landowners, and today he's considered one of the most important scholars of modern slavery in the world. In April 1983, Rezende was engaged in developing a network of trade unions and land reformation collectives in the Amazon when a group of 5 runaways from Cristalino came to his parish. The youngest was just 17 years old. Immediately, he called upon the government of Pará and traveled with one of the workers to Brasilia, where he revealed Volkswagen's slavery system in a press conference. With the help of his fellow activists of the CPT and labor organizations in Pará, other victims began to testify and several similar reports quickly followed. Rezende acted as a bridge between grassroots denunciation and public information, spreading the word about what was going on in the ranch to the rest of Brazil and abroad. Soon enough, the news reached a number of newspapers in Germany as well, and for the first time, Volkswagen suffered a powerful blow in its reputation. Finally, dark labor was on the move. But they were not alone. At the same period, another labor movement arose on Volkswagen's doorsteps in São Paulo, this time by the free workers of urban industry. After 2 oil shocks, ascending inflation, and the sharpening of Brazil's foreign debt, the working class was devastated by the loss of their purchasing power and poor laboring conditions. With the rise of neoliberalism in the United States, the military regime lost its most important funding source and was no longer able to use social welfare to meet popular dissatisfaction. That opened the way so a fresh generation of trade unions could lead a legendary series of strikes all over the country against big corporations that had been swallowing their surplus value for decades. Now free labor was also on the loose, and Volkswagen was one of the main targets. The workers in São Paulo brought to light the German company's complicity in the torture of labor union leaders and watched closely as Father Rezende denounced what she was doing in the Amazon. Connecting with the CPT, they developed a joint strategy of political struggle, mutually supporting one another's claims. In May 1983, the young deputy Expedito Soares of the Workers' Party, which is the party that elected Lula, to give an example, himself a former leader of a steel trade union, delivered three speeches on the slavery in Cristalino at the Legislative Assembly of São Paulo. Later that year, he and Father Rezende integrated an expedition into the ranch and produced a report on what they saw, the conclusion confirming what the runaways said. They pushed forward a multilateral campaign until slavery in Volkswagen became an international affair and the company's popularity as a clean employer was shattered. 2 labor movements working in solidarity against a common oppressor, just like Du Bois had envisioned in a different context. The representatives of Volkswagen in Brazil still tried to resist the 2 labor movements for a bit longer, but with the dictatorship waning under an economic crisis, the pressure became overwhelming. In December 1986, she finally surrendered and decided to shut down the ranch, which was shortly sold to a Japanese family of businessmen. The fate of the remaining workers enslaved at Cristalino is uncertain, and we only know for sure that none of them received compensations for their toil. So I'm going to finish with this picture of 4 surviving men that work at the ranch. They were summoned in 2025, earlier this year, to testify on Volkswagen's trial when Volkswagen was convicted. As I mentioned in the beginning, it took 40 years until Volkswagen was held accountable for her crimes. But hundreds of other companies that practice the same kind of modern slavery remain unpunished, and no redress has been given to their nameless faceless victims. Meanwhile, slavery remains active in Brazil to this day, with more than 2,000 people officially rescued in 2024 alone, 77% of whom are black men. Du Bois' family said multiple times that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. As long as dark labor is in motion, that statement will be true about the 21st century as well. Until we achieve a comprehensive program of reparations, it will be our moral duty to stand against slavery in all of its modern faces. Thank you.
We have time for questions. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And for those watching online, please, when you ask your question, give it, project, so that folks listening from as far away as Brazil can hear you.
Okay.
So how much did you say the settlement was that had just been awarded in 2025, 40 years after the litigation started?
$30,000, a fine. $30,000. It's 165 million reais, Brazilian money. But when it turns to dollars, it's 30,000.
And where is that money awarded to?
Well, that money, it's a legally sophisticated issue, so that money would not be directed to the workers themselves. It would be used to fund public projects that deal with modern slavery in Brazil. So to this day, there was no compensation for the workers themselves. That is true. To none of them, actually.
The other brief comment I wanted to make about this idea of installing dictatorships to open up areas to private investment. It reminds me of what's going on with the so-called ceasefire agreement in Palestine, of which one of the main points of the agreement was to enact regime change in Palestine and open up Palestine to economic investment.
Correct, and so far the only discussion about reparations have dealt with monetary reparations, and the main issue, which is the issue of land redistribution. Imagine in a state larger than New York City, where is that land now? A part of the estate has been occupied by workers that tried to create a settlement around 2008, 2009, but they still have not succeeded in making their land their own. So the issue of land redistribution, which is also crucial in the case of Palestine, like you expel people, you give them some kind of compensation, if any at all, but you do not address the land, which is the real source of all this wealth. So that is the point.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I am trying to control all the emotions that I'm feeling, but thank you for an incredible talk. So in South Africa, we have and had the kind of indentured labor, migrant labor system under apartheid, under British colonialism and Dutch colonialism before that. I have a million questions, but I guess you probably answered it and I just missed it. But are there specific places where the majority of the people enslaved on these plantations, on these farms and ranches, come from in Brazil, or are they from all over the country? And there's not like one kind of central.
Well, in this case, they came from two main regions. Now, one was this area comprehending those 3 states over here, and it's important to say that when this happened, there was no borders. This was a single state, right? All of this was the state of Goiás. This is called Mato Grosso. This is what we call in Brazil the Central West. Some of them came from here because the range was, most of those ranches using that bondage were located in southeastern Pará. The cats will travel here to fetch them here, or they would recruit migrants for the northeast, which is this area, an area that to this day suffers with droughts, which is the poorest region in Brazil. Some of them will be traveling towards the Amazon looking for job opportunities, and they will be trapped in the same kind of scheme. So they came from 2 directions, the Central West and the Northeast.
Thank you. And thank you again.
You're right. Charles.
Apologies, man. I was talking throughout your lecture, but my question is: you mentioned reparations.
Mhm.
What does that look like? I know there's African Americans talking about reparations. There's Haitians talking about reparations for France, and other parts of the world. What does that look like?
Well, actually, the debate on reparations is kind of coming to the fore in Brazil more and more these days. This year, a bill was presented in Congress to propose to amend the Constitution to establish a permanent fund of money that will be redistributed for people of African descent. And this money is supposed to come from fines paid by corporations, industrial businesses who commit wrongs against black people. But so far, and there is a significant social movement rising addressing the issues of land distribution I mentioned before, but at the institutional level, the most important reparation measure we have accomplished in these last 20 years was affirmative action. We changed the faces of the universities and public institutions in Brazil that in no doubt gave Afro-Brazilians with a number of job opportunities and social ascending opportunities they will never have without affirmative action. But this is still in a very institutional logic of people who are selected when they apply for certain positions. So it's still limited. But as in the United States, there is a number of proposals circulating. Some of them have to do with the quilombos. I don't know if you're aware of what quilombo are, the Brazilian Maroons, so to say. The prospect of returning then the land that was stolen in these slavery schemes. And the reason why I chose to give this talk on this topic is because I think when we think about reparations, we have to consider how modern slavery goes into this debate. And not only the chattel slavery prior to 1865 in your case, 1888 in our case. The slavery is still going on, and that slavery, the ongoing slavery, has to be repaired as well. So that was one of the points of the talk.
Thank you so much. It was such a fantastic presentation. And I want to go along the lines with your question. And you mentioned towards the end of the presentation that it's only recently that Volkswagen was held accountable. This year. So what was the contribution of the slaves and of the workers into that process?
What happens is that a research group led by the priest that denounced this scheme back in the 1980s, a research group that he still coordinates in the Federal University of Rio, they managed to establish a project, but they traveled back to Pará, and they managed to find 8 men that had worked in the range back in the 1970s and 80s. They took a new report from them, and when the time came, they were brought to the trial to bear witness to what they had suffered under Volkswagen. And their testimony was one of the key reasons why Volkswagen was convicted in the first place, because we have no record. So this is very different from discussing chattel slavery, which we're going to find documents say in May 1863, so-and-so was sold to so-and-so. You have documents registered. The only registers we have is the oral testimony they gave. So that was the role they played.
I am also trying to think of the situations of the slaves in prison now in relation to what's happening globally, internationally. Mm-hmm. So there are, especially in the past 20 years, there are many workers from the South going to prison for work. And also, you mentioned the Quilombo, who is very active too.
Yeah. Or the Lacu in the case of Haiti.
There's the Lacu too. So how do those international, transnational linkages work in support of the slaves in Brazil and the demands for restitution and reparation?
Well, actually, that is one point that is worth addressing. That Brazil has one of the best national legislations on the matter, and The responsibility for this was also from this group of people that have been researching for this for a long time. In 2003, there was a bill that altered the Brazilian criminal legislation, introducing a legal standard that was able to encompass this kind of ongoing slavery. And this is also the result of a series of international exchanges over this topic. But it is interesting to notice, and I didn't have the time to mention this in the talk, that one of the most important supporters of the campaign against Volkswagen were third world solidarity movements in Germany that were connected with Father Rezende by his network of liberation theologians in the German Catholic Church as well. So that was the reason this came to the public, because it was denounced both in Brazil and in Germany as well. And you're going to find news from German newspapers from that time, as well as from now, as Volkswagen was convicted. So I believe this process of sharing information and making things public in multiple spaces is what is so central about it.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask about that photograph of the cat. Could you just talk more about that photograph and the man who's in the truck and the cats around him, I assume, if you know any information?
Oh yes, so the context is in 1983, a group of congressmen along with Father Rezende, they made this thing public and they demanded to be granted access to the ranch, which they managed to do. And when they were getting in, there was this car getting out. They stepped out of the car, they asked, oh, what are you doing? And the man driving the car asked, who are you? What are you doing here? No, we came to make an inspection, etc., etc., etc. And he said, I don't know which one of them was, but it was one of the cats that said, no, there is no slavery here. And the proof I can give you is that I'm trying to get back this guy because he was indebted with me and he ran away. So he's making me lose time going after him. So I am the one who is suffering economic losses with this process, okay? And so this was his excuse, and this was the context where the photo was taken. I believe from this angle you can't see no guns, but they were certainly carrying guns at this moment. Yeah. So this is from 1983.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Just wanted to say, from one Paraense to another, and feeling, I think it's awesome to have perspectives from northern and northeastern Brazil represented when talking about the political exploitation that happens there. I feel like so often that is glossed over when the Amazon and the hyper-exploitation of dark labor in the Nordeste is such a key of it. So I think it's incredible that voices like yours are being platformed here. And I wanted to ask about why this was able to be dealt with by the government now, when for so long the Brazilian state's policy has largely been that the stability of liberal democracy in Brazil depends on not acknowledging any of the evil that the dictatorship did. So what has changed recently that allowed a case like this to finally be undertaken by the government, and what incentives were working from outside of the state to bring justice here?
Well, thanks for your insightful comment. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Actually, you give me the opportunity to make some clarification. And one of the reasons why I chose to speak about this topic is because the memory we have of the Brazilian military dictatorship is too much focused on what was going on in the economic center of Brazil, that is São Paulo and Rio. We often remember the imprisonment of civilians. We often remember the imprisonment of left-wing politicians. We remember the closing of Congress. We remember political repression in urban centers. But this is another side of the dictatorship that we often ignore. Like what was going on in the periphery of Brazil. And that was exactly what I wanted to do with this talk. Now, what changed? That is an interesting question. What happens is that the dictatorship ends in 1985, and then a group of people, including these activists I mentioned here, they started building a larger and larger network to try to bring this to public attention and force Brazil to reckon this history of modern slavery. And this took a long way. Like, it was only in 1995 that the Ministry of Labor in Brazil created a special department dedicated to inspecting and preventing modern slavery in hinterland areas, 1995. In 2003, you have the bill that changed Brazilian legislation, making it possible to open lawsuits on companies for this kind of crime, specifying exactly what kinds of behavior count as modern slavery. And then in 2013, you have the Comissão da Verdade, the Commission of Truth, a parliamentary commission that tried to bring to the fore all of the wrongdoings of the dictatorship. This part was slightly excluded. And then only now that we have all of this process gathering, coming to another end, it was possible, there were resources available to go after those people, to bring them to justice, and especially reach out to the former slaves to bear their testimonies again. But as I said, the many other companies that were doing the same thing, they had never been held accountable for what they did. So it's still an ongoing process. But I would say that the opening to democracy in the end of the 1980s was what made it possible for this to happen.
Well, thanks again, Heitor, for a landmark, I think, talk. And safe travels when they come. And thank you all for being here with us today, in person and online.